March 4th, 1943. The North Atlantic was a graveyard of steel and salt, where the cold water held more secrets than any war room could ever contain. On this particular day, the ocean would swallow 5 German U-boats in a coordinated strike that military historians would study for decades. But the key to this devastating blow didn't come from an admiral's brilliant strategy or a captain's courage under fire. It came from a 23-year-old woman sitting in a cramped radio room in Liverpool, her fingers trembling over a telegraph key as she made a decision that could change the course of the war or end her career in disgrace. Before we dive deeper into this incredible true story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more fascinating historical accounts like this one. Sarah Mitchell had never imagined she'd be part of the war effort in any meaningful way. Growing up in Manchester, she'd trained as a secretary, learning shorthand and typing with the expectation of a quiet office job. Her father worked in a textile factory, and her mother took in sewing to help make ends meet. They were a modest family, respectable and hardworking, with no military tradition or connections to the naval world. Sarah had been the first in her family to complete secondary education, and her parents had been proud when she secured her secretarial certificate in 1938. But when the war broke out in 1939, everything changed. Sarah watched as her younger brother enlisted in the army, as her neighborhood transformed with blackout curtains and air raid shelters, as the normal rhythms of life were disrupted by the demands of total war. She felt restless in her civilian job, typing correspondence for a shipping insurance company. The work felt trivial when merchant ships were being sunk daily in the Atlantic. By the summer of 1941, after a particularly devastating air raid on Manchester that destroyed homes on her street and killed a family she'd known since childhood, Sarah made her decision. She would volunteer. The Women's Royal Naval Service accepted her application in August 1941. After basic training at a facility in Scotland, where she learned naval protocol, physical conditioning, and the basics of military discipline, she was sent for specialized training in communications. The instructors quickly noticed something unusual about Sarah. She had an exceptional ear for Morse code, able to distinguish individual operators by their unique sending rhythms, what telegraphers called their fist. More importantly, she demonstrated an intuitive ability to see patterns in seemingly random data, to sense when something was out of place or significant in a stream of routine traffic. By December 1941, Sarah found herself assigned to the Western Approaches Command in Liverpool. The facility was the nerve center of the Battle of the Atlantic, where Britain coordinated its desperate struggle to keep supply lines open against Germany's wolf packs of U-boats. The headquarters occupied a massive underground complex, protected by thick concrete against German bombs. Walking into that facility for the first time, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This wasn't training anymore. This was the real war, and mistakes here cost lives measured not in ones or twos, but in hundreds. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking. Sarah and her fellow Wrens worked 12-hour shifts, monitoring radio traffic, plotting convoy movements, and trying to decipher the increasingly sophisticated German naval codes. The operations room never slept. Day and night, personnel cycled through in shifts, maintaining constant vigilance over the Atlantic battlefield. The air was always thick with cigarette smoke and tension, the lighting harsh and artificial, the temperature carefully controlled to protect the sensitive equipment. Sarah shared a boarding house room with 3 other Wrens, young women from different parts of Britain who'd all volunteered for service. They became close friends, bound by shared experiences and the need to decompress from the stress of their work. In the evenings, when they weren't on duty, they'd sometimes go to a nearby pub or attend dances organized for service personnel. These moments of normalcy were precious, brief escapes from the weight of what they witnessed daily in the operations room. Every day brought news of merchant ships torpedoed, sailors lost to the icy waters, and supplies that would never reach Britain's shores. Sarah learned to read the loss reports with a professional detachment during working hours, but at night, alone in her narrow bed, the numbers haunted her. Each ship represented dozens or hundreds of men, each with families, with lives and dreams that ended in seconds when a torpedo struck. She began having recurring nightmares about drowning in cold, dark water, about watching ships sink and being unable to help. The psychological toll of the work affected everyone differently. Some personnel became hardened, building emotional walls to protect themselves. Others struggled openly, requiring reassignment or medical leave. Sarah found her own coping mechanism in focusing intensely on the technical aspects of her job. She studied everything she could about U-boat tactics, radio procedures, and signal analysis. She volunteered for extra training courses. She kept detailed personal notes about patterns she observed, even though this technically violated security protocols about taking work home. The pressure was constant, the stakes immeasurable. One mistake, one misread signal, could mean the difference between a convoy reaching port safely and hundreds of men drowning in the dark Atlantic. Sarah had witnessed such mistakes, In January 1943, a plotting error had contributed to a convoy sailing into a U-boat concentration, resulting in 7 ships sunk in a single night. The officer responsible hadn't made a careless error. He'd simply been exhausted after too many consecutive shifts. In his tired mind had transposed 2 digits in a coordinate. 7 ships, over 300 men, because of 2 transposed numbers. The officer had been quietly reassigned, but Sarah never forgot the look on his face when he realized what had happened. On the morning of March 4th, Sarah reported for duty at 6 in the morning. The winter darkness still clung to Liverpool's streets, and a bitter wind blew in from the Mersey. She'd barely slept the night before, kept awake by a combination of the cold in her boarding house room and a vague sense of unease she couldn't quite identify. Walking through the pre-dawn streets, she passed buildings damaged in earlier air raids, their empty windows like dark eyes watching her progress. A few other service personnel moved through the gloom, heading to their own duties, but mostly the streets were empty and silent. She made her way through the security checkpoints, showing her identification to guards who knew her by sight but checked everyone regardless. The descent into the underground operations room always felt like entering another world, leaving behind the cold, dark surface for the artificially lit realm of strategic warfare. The corridors were painted in utilitarian colors, institutional green and gray, with exposed pipes running along the ceilings and the constant hum of ventilation systems. Sarah entered the operations room and took her position at her station. The massive space stretched before her, a hive of controlled activity. The room hummed with quiet intensity as dozens of personnel worked at their various tasks. In the center, a huge table displayed a map of the North Atlantic, with colored markers representing convoys, escort vessels, and known or suspected U-boat positions. Wrens and junior officers moved around the table with long poles, adjusting markers as new information arrived. Along the walls, banks of communications equipment crackled and hummed. Telephone operators relayed information in low voices, and cryptanalysts worked on intercepted German messages at special desks, equipped with the latest decoding equipment. Sarah's station consisted of a radio receiver, a telegraph key, plotting tools, and a logbook where she recorded all signals she detected. She also had access to reference materials, including frequency charts, known German call signs, and previous signal patterns. She began her shift by reviewing the night watch's logs, familiarizing herself with what had happened while she was off duty. 3 convoys were currently at sea in the western approaches zone, several escort groups were conducting sweeps, and intelligence reported possible U-boat activity in multiple sectors. Sarah's supervisor that morning was Lieutenant Commander James Hartley, a veteran of the First World War who'd been recalled to service. He was 52 years old, with gray hair, cut military short, and a weathered face that rarely showed emotion. He'd served aboard destroyers in the previous war, earning commendations for actions at Jutland and in convoy escort duties. When the Second World War began, he'd been working as a shipping clerk in Southampton, and the Admiralty had called him back despite his age because of his experience and steady temperament. Hartley was a stern man, traditional in his views about military hierarchy and proper procedures. When women had first been assigned to operational duties at Western Approaches Command, he'd been openly skeptical. He belonged to a generation that saw warfare as fundamentally a male domain, and the idea of young women making tactical decisions had struck him as not just unusual, but potentially dangerous. He'd made no secret of these views in his initial months at the facility, though he'd always been professionally correct in his behavior. However, over the months working together, Sarah had earned his grudging respect through her accuracy and dedication. She never made careless mistakes, never complained about the demanding schedule, and demonstrated a work ethic that matched or exceeded that of her male colleagues. Hartley had slowly, almost reluctantly, revised his opinions. He still believed in doing things by the book, in following established protocols, but he'd learned that competence wasn't determined by gender. Still, their relationship remained formal and sometimes tense. Where Sarah had developed an intuitive sense for patterns that sometimes led her to conclusions beyond what strict procedural analysis would support, Hartley believed in following established protocols to the letter. He trusted systems and procedures, the accumulated wisdom of naval tradition, more than individual hunches or intuition. These philosophical differences had led to friction before. In February, Sarah had suggested a course change for a convoy based on pattern analysis of radio traffic, and Hartley had overruled her, sticking with the route determined by official intelligence. The convoy had made it through safely, but Sarah had never known whether her suggestion would have been better or worse. Hartley had told her afterward that, in the absence of certainty, following established procedures was always the correct choice. It was a lesson in military thinking that Sarah understood intellectually, but sometimes struggled with emotionally. Around 9 in the morning, Sarah began picking up unusual radio activity. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just a series of brief transmissions on frequencies known to be used by U-boats. The signals were using the latest version of the Enigma cipher, which meant she couldn't understand the actual content. The cryptanalysts might eventually decode them, but that could take hours or days, and by then the tactical situation would have changed completely. But there was something about the pattern, the timing, and the signal strength that caught her attention. Sarah had listened to thousands of hours of German naval radio traffic over the past 15 months. She'd developed an almost musical sense for how U-boats communicated. Different U-boat commanders had different communication styles. Some were verbose, sending long messages. Others were terse, using minimal radio time. Some followed rigid schedules, others were more unpredictable. What she was hearing now was different from normal patrol communications. The transmissions were extremely brief, lasting only a few seconds each, and they were timed in a way that suggested coordination. She marked the bearings using reports from direction-finding stations along the coast and noted the times in her log, watching as more signals appeared over the next hour. Each time a signal came through, she'd quickly work with the bearing data, plotting the approximate location on her personal chart. The work required intense concentration. Radio direction finding wasn't precise. It gave you a bearing line from each receiving station, and you estimated position by seeing where multiple bearing lines intersected. But atmospheric conditions, signal strength, and equipment limitations meant there was always uncertainty. A bearing could be off by several degrees, which at several hundred miles distance could mean a position error of tens of miles. Sarah had to account for all these factors, while also trying to distinguish between actual U-boat transmissions and false contacts created by atmospheric interference or other radio sources. By 11 o'clock, Sarah had identified at least 7 distinct transmission sources, all moving in what appeared to be a coordinated pattern. Her chart showed a line of position estimates stretching roughly north to south across the convoy routes. She plotted their approximate positions based on direction-finding data from other coastal stations, and a picture began to emerge that made her pulse quicken. The U-boats seemed to be converging on a position roughly 400 miles west of Ireland, forming what naval tacticians called a patrol line, a spread-out formation designed to maximize the chances of detecting a convoy passing through the area. She checked the convoy routes on the main plotting table and felt her stomach tighten. Convoy HX-229, consisting of 40 merchant ships carrying vital supplies from New York, was heading directly toward that area. The convoy had departed 10 days earlier, loaded with food, fuel, ammunition, aircraft parts, and other critical materials that Britain desperately needed. The ships ranged from modern freighters to older vessels pulled back into service, some capable of 12 knots, others struggling to maintain 8. They were escorted by a group of Royal Navy destroyers, corvettes, and frigates, experienced crews who'd made this run many times before. They were scheduled to pass through that zone around midnight on March 5th. Sarah immediately reported her findings to Lieutenant Commander Hartley. She brought her charts and logs to his desk, laying them out carefully. He listened as she explained what she'd been tracking, examined her plots with a careful eye, and nodded thoughtfully. She watched his face as he processed the information, seeing the calculations happening behind his eyes. However, his response was measured and cautious. He picked up a folder from his desk, the morning's intelligence briefing from Admiralty, and showed her the relevant section. The official intelligence assessment, based on decoded signals from 2 days earlier, placed the main U-boat concentration further south, approximately 150 miles from where Sarah's analysis suggested. The escort commander for HX-229 had been briefed accordingly based on this intelligence and had planned his route to avoid that area, steering slightly north of the usual track. Hartley acknowledged Sarah's observations, but noted that they were based on incomplete data and pattern analysis, rather than decoded intelligence. He spoke carefully, not dismissively, but with the weight of experience and responsibility. Without confirmed decryptions to verify the content of the messages she'd been tracking, he explained they couldn't know for certain what those U-boats were doing or where they were heading. They might be forming a patrol line, as Sarah suggested, or they might be dispersing to patrol individually, or responding to a reported convoy in a different area entirely. The intelligence from Admiralty had been compiled by the Submarine Tracking Room, staffed by experienced analysts with access to all available information from multiple sources, including decoded Enigma traffic, direction-finding data, and aerial reconnaissance reports. Hartley pointed out that overriding such intelligence based on direction-finding bearings alone would require extraordinary justification. He wasn't saying Sarah was wrong, but he was saying that her evidence wasn't sufficient to contradict the official assessment. Sarah pressed her case, explaining that the brief transmission pattern she'd identified was consistent with a new tactical protocol the Germans seemed to be using, where U-boats maintained radio silence, except for very short position updates to coordinate patrol lines. She'd noticed this pattern developing over the past few weeks, but hadn't had enough data to present it as a finding until now. This wasn't just about the bearings, she argued. It was about understanding how German tactics were evolving. The next 2 hours were agonizing for Sarah. She returned to her station but couldn't focus on routine monitoring. She continued to track the signals she'd identified, and the pattern became clearer with each new transmission. The U-boats were definitely forming a patrol line, and unless she was completely misreading the situation, HX-229 was sailing straight into an ambush. She plotted and replotted the positions, checked her calculations multiple times, considered alternative interpretations of the data, but every analysis led to the same conclusion. Other personnel in the operations room had noticed the exchange between Sarah and Hartley. In the close confines of the facility, where everyone worked together daily under intense pressure, personal dynamics and professional disagreements didn't go unnoticed. Some of her fellow Wrens gave her sympathetic looks, having been in similar situations where their observations conflicted with official assessments. A few of the male officers watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Sarah approached Hartley twice more as the afternoon progressed. The first time, at 1 o'clock, she brought up dated plots showing that 2 more U-boats had joined the apparent patrol line. The second time, at 2:30, she presented calculations showing that at current speeds and courses, HX-229 would reach the patrol line area around midnight, exactly when the U-boats would have completed their formation. Each time, Hartley listened patiently, examined her work, and acknowledged that her analysis was competent and her concerns legitimate. But each time he held to his position. The official intelligence took precedence, and without decoded message content to confirm her theory, he couldn't justify ordering a major course change for an entire convoy based on direction-finding bearings and pattern analysis, however skillful. The decision wasn't just about this one convoy, Hartley explained during their second conversation. If Western Approach's command started overriding Admiralty intelligence on a regular basis, it would undermine the entire intelligence system. There had to be trust in the process, in the expertise of the specialized teams at Bletchley Park and the submarine tracking room, who had access to information that local commanders didn't. The system worked most of the time, and breaking protocol should only happen in the most extreme circumstances, with the most compelling evidence. Sarah understood his reasoning intellectually. Military organizations operated on hierarchy and established procedures precisely because individual judgment, however well-intentioned, could be wrong. If every officer or analyst acted on personal hunches that contradicted official intelligence, the result would be chaos. But she also felt deep in her bones that this time the official intelligence was wrong or outdated, and that following procedure would result in disaster. At 2 p.m, Sarah made a decision that would define her life. She'd been observing not just the U-boat signals, but also routine position reports from Royal Navy escort vessels accompanying other convoys in the area. One of these escorts, the destroyer HMS Vanquisher, was operating about 60 miles north of the suspected U-boat patrol line, conducting an independent sweep. Sarah realized that if Vanquisher altered course southward, it could potentially detect the U-boats and confirm or refute her analysis, but suggesting such a move was far beyond her authority. Nevertheless, she prepared a detailed brief, including all her signal plots, timing analysis, and her reasoning. She included calculations showing how Vanquisher could reach the area, conduct a search pattern, and still return to its assigned zone. Then she requested a formal meeting with Hartley, not at her station, but in his office. This was highly irregular, but Hartley, perhaps sensing her determination, agreed. In his cramped office, away from the operations room, Sarah laid out everything. She spread her charts across his desk, showing him the progression of signals throughout the day. She showed him patterns in the signal traffic that suggested the U-boats were using a new tactical communication protocol, staying silent except for brief, coordinated position updates. Each U-boat, she explained, was transmitting only for a few seconds at specific intervals, just enough to confirm its position to the others in the formation, but not long enough to allow for easy detection or targeting. She explained how the signal strengths and bearings formed a coherent picture of a patrol line. She'd calculated the spacing between U-boats, approximately 15 nautical miles apart, which was consistent with optimal search patterns for detecting convoys. She showed him how the timing of transmissions suggested a coordinated command structure, with one boat likely acting as the group leader coordinating the others. Hartley listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled in front of his face, his eyes moving between Sarah and her charts. When she finished her technical presentation, there was a long silence. Outside his office, they could hear the muted sounds of the operations room, the voices and equipment that never stopped. Finally, Hartley spoke. He asked her to explain again why she believed the official intelligence was wrong or outdated. Sarah took a breath and laid out her reasoning carefully. The decoded messages that formed the basis of the official assessment were from 2 days ago. In that time, the U-boats had likely been repositioning, moving from their previously identified concentration to form this new patrol line. The German tactics were evolving, she argued, becoming more sophisticated in response to improved Allied detection capabilities. She acknowledged that she could be wrong, that her analysis was based partially on intuition developed over months of listening to these patterns, on a feel for how the Germans operated that couldn't be fully quantified or explained in technical terms. It was pattern recognition that combined technical data with something more subjective, an understanding built from thousands of hours of experience that she couldn't entirely put into words. But she also argued that the cost of investigating was minimal compared to the potential cost of inaction. Sending HMS Vanquisher to check the area would take the destroyer away from its patrol for a few hours. If Sarah was wrong, the ship would waste some fuel and time. If she was right, they might save an entire convoy. Hartley asked her the crucial question then, his voice quiet but intense. If she were in command, if the decision were entirely hers with all the responsibility that entailed, would she stake her career on this analysis? Would she risk the professional disgrace of being wrong, the doubt that would follow her, the possible end of her naval service? Sarah met his eyes and answered without hesitation. Yes, she would. Because even if she was wrong, she'd rather be wrong trying to save those merchant sailors than right while knowing she'd stayed silent. She'd rather end her naval career having made a genuine attempt to prevent a disaster than continue it, knowing she'd let caution and protocol override what she believed was the truth. The men on those merchant ships had families, had lives that mattered. They were depending on people like her and Hartley to use every skill and tool available to protect them. How could she face herself if she stayed quiet and they died? Something in Sarah's conviction, or perhaps in the evidence she'd assembled, moved Hartley. He told her to return to her station and to speak to no one about their conversation. Then he picked up his telephone and began making calls. Sarah didn't know what he said or to whom, but 30 minutes later, new orders came through. HMS Vanquisher was directed to proceed south-southwest and conduct an anti-submarine sweep in a specific area, the area Sarah had identified. The afternoon dragged on with unbearable slowness. Sarah continued her monitoring, and the U-boat signals continued their pattern. At 6 in the evening, Vanquisher reported making sonar contact. By 7, depth charges were being dropped. The first U-boat, U-384, was damaged and forced to surface, where Vanquisher's guns finished it off. The action alerted the other U-boats in the patrol line, but it also brought additional Royal Navy vessels racing to the area. Over the next 6 hours, a chaotic battle unfolded in the dark Atlantic waters. U-631 was caught on the surface by aircraft called in from Iceland and was sunk by bombs. U-432 was depth charged by the corvette HMS Anemone and destroyed. U-665 attempted to escape, but was tracked by sonar and sunk by a coordinated attack from 2 destroyers. U-333 suffered mechanical damage from near-miss depth charges and was scuttled by its crew. 5 U-boats lost, and the patrol line was shattered before convoy HX-209 reached the area. The convoy sailed through unmolested just after midnight, its 40 merchant ships and their precious cargoes of food, fuel, ammunition, and equipment reaching Britain safely. Over 400 merchant sailors and naval personnel who would have died that night instead lived to see the dawn. The escort commander never knew how close they'd come to disaster, and for security reasons, the full story of Sarah's analysis couldn't be shared widely. In the operations room, as reports came in throughout the night, Sarah barely allowed herself to feel relief. She'd been right, but she also understood the weight of what might have happened. If her analysis had been wrong, if Vanquisher had been sent on a wild chase and left its assigned area vulnerable, if the U-boats had instead been where official intelligence said they were, she would have been responsible for a costly mistake. Lieutenant Commander Hartley called her into his office again in the early hours of March 5th. His expression was unreadable as always, but when he spoke, there was something different in his tone. He told her that her analysis had been vindicated by events, that her work had directly contributed to a significant tactical victory, and that he would be recommending her for commendation. But he also told her, quite seriously, that she must never again make such a decision lightly, that the burden of command, even in a small way, meant living with the consequences of being wrong as much as being right. Sarah understood. She also understood that she'd crossed a line that morning when she'd decided to push beyond her assigned role, to trust her judgment even when it contradicted official assessments. It was a line many people in the war had to cross at crucial moments, and living with that responsibility was part of what the conflict demanded from everyone, regardless of rank or position. The official commendation came through 3 weeks later, though the citation was deliberately vague about specifics for security reasons. Sarah continued her work at Western Approach's command for the remainder of the war, and her superiors increasingly trusted her analytical judgments. She trained other Wrens in signal analysis, passing on not just the technical skills, but also the importance of trusting patterns when the evidence supported them. After the war ended, Sarah left naval service and returned to civilian life. She married a Royal Navy officer she'd met during the war, had 2 children, and worked as a teacher. She rarely spoke about her wartime service, partly because much of it remained classified for decades, and partly because she'd never been comfortable with attention. The generation that fought the war often felt this way, seeing their contributions as simply what had to be done, rather than anything deserving special recognition. It wasn't until the 1980s, when historians began piecing together the full story of the Battle of the Atlantic using newly declassified documents, that Sarah's role in the events of March 4th, 1943, came to light. Researchers found the operations logs, Hartley's reports, and signal records. They interviewed veterans and compared German and British accounts. The picture that emerged was of a young woman who'd seen a pattern others missed and had the courage to stand by her analysis when it mattered most. Some historians have debated whether Sarah's intervention was truly decisive. They point out that other factors contributed to the U-boat's defeat that night, including improved sonar technology, better trained escort crews, and the presence of aircraft support. They note that convoy HX-229 might have detected the U-boat patrol line on its own and taken evasive action. These points are valid, and Sarah herself would have agreed with them. Wars aren't won by single individuals or single actions, but by thousands of people doing their jobs competently and, occasionally, rising to moments of exceptional performance. But what makes Sarah's story significant isn't just that her analysis was correct or that it contributed to sinking 5 U-boats. It's what her story reveals about the nature of the Battle of the Atlantic and the Second World War more broadly. This was a conflict where technology, intelligence, training, and human judgment all intersected in complex ways. Victory often depended on people at every level of the military hierarchy being willing to think critically, to question assumptions when evidence warranted it, and to take responsibility for difficult decisions. Sarah's story is also significant because it illustrates the role of women in the war effort. The Women's Royal Naval Service, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, and countless women in civilian roles performed work that was absolutely essential to Allied victory. They weren't simply filling in for men who'd gone to fight. They were doing skilled, demanding work that required intelligence, training, and dedication. Many, like Sarah, made decisions that had direct tactical and strategic consequences. The cramped radio room in Liverpool where Sarah worked, the endless hours of monitoring signals, the painstaking analysis of patterns, the tension of trying to make sense of fragmentary information, this was the unglamorous reality of much of the war. For every dramatic naval battle or infantry assault, there were thousands of people working in operations rooms, signal stations, supply depots, and maintenance facilities, doing the detailed, exhausting work that made those headline actions possible. Lieutenant Commander Hartley's role in the story is also worth considering. He could have dismissed Sarah's analysis entirely. Many officers would have, particularly given the era's attitudes about women in military roles and the strong emphasis on following established procedures. Instead, Hartley listened, evaluated the evidence, and ultimately trusted Sarah's judgment enough to act on it. His willingness to take that risk, to potentially stake his career on the analysis of a junior Wren, showed the kind of leadership that helped win the war. The 5 U-boats lost on March 4, 1943, represented a significant blow to Germany's Atlantic campaign. Each submarine had cost millions of Reichsmarks to build and required months to construct. More importantly, each boat's crew represented years of training and experience. U-boat crews were among the most highly trained personnel in the German Navy, and their loss couldn't be easily replaced. As the war progressed and Allied anti-submarine capabilities improved, the loss rate among U-boats climbed steadily, eventually making service aboard them nearly suicidal. For the German families who lost sons, husbands, and fathers on those 5 U-boats, the day was a tragedy. War creates these painful ironies, where one side's victory is another side's catastrophe, where the skills and courage of individual service members on both sides are consumed by the vast machinery of industrial conflict. The German submariners who died that night were, in their own context, doing their duty as they understood it, just as Sarah was doing hers. Sarah Mitchell lived until 2003, reaching the age of 83. In her final years, she gave several interviews to historians and participated in a documentary about the Battle of the Atlantic. When asked about the events of March 4, 1943, she consistently deflected personal credit. She emphasized the team effort involved, the training she'd received, the support from colleagues, and the decision Lieutenant Commander Hartley had made to trust her analysis. She spoke more about the merchant sailors whose lives were saved than about her own role in saving them. One interviewer asked her whether she'd been frightened when she made the decision to push her analysis so forcefully. Sarah was quiet for a moment before answering. She said that, yes, she'd been terrified. Not of being wrong, although that concerned her, but of being right and not doing anything. She said that she'd thought about those 40 merchant ships, about the crews aboard them who had no idea they were sailing into danger, about their families back home who were waiting for them. She'd thought about all the previous convoys she'd watched on the plotting tables, all the markers that had disappeared when ships were sunk. And she'd decided that she couldn't live with herself if she stayed silent, and those men died when she might have prevented it. That simple statement captures something essential about the people who won the Second World War. They were ordinary individuals, doing difficult jobs under enormous pressure, who chose to take responsibility when moments of decision arrived. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as people who had work to do and who did it as well as they could. Sarah Mitchell, sitting in her radio room in Liverpool, reading patterns in signal traffic and making a choice that would save hundreds of lives, was one of thousands of such people whose names and stories have largely been forgotten, but whose contributions were absolutely essential. The signal girl who timed a ridiculous move that sank 5 U-boats on March 4th, 1943, wasn't ridiculous at all. She was competent, dedicated, and brave. She was willing to trust her training and judgment even when doing so meant going against established procedures and risking professional consequences. She represents the best of what her generation offered in that terrible conflict, the willingness to do difficult things because they needed to be done without expectation of recognition or reward. Her story deserves to be remembered, not because it's unique, but because it's representative of so many other stories that remain untold.